Learn to Love Women and Jesus Anyway. Subtitles are meant to get you interested in the book, and I hope that one does. Sex, Mom, and God is the third and last book in a trilogy. Each of the books in the trilogy are standalone. In other words, you can buy one and read it without having to read all three. If you get halfway through one and pitch it across the room, maybe the next one will be better and you'll like it. So either way, it works out. But let me just review what these are. The first is Crazy for God, a memoir with the subtitle, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right, and Lived to Take All or Almost All of It Back. And that is this book here in paperback. The second volume is Patience with God, Faith for People Who Don't Like Religion or Atheism, and that is this volume here. And the third is this book here, Sex, Mom, and God, How the Bible's Strange Take on Sex Led to Crazy Politics, and How I Learned to Love Women and Jesus Anyway. So without any further ado, what I will begin with tonight is to read you the introductory remarks from Sex, Mom, and God, which will set up my talk, but also let you know a little bit about what this book covers in terms of what the reader would find in it. One of the things I love most about being with my grandchildren is that they only know me now. So before I explain why I had sex with an ice sculpture and how my family helped push the Republican Party into the embrace of the religious right and chronicle my family's complicity in several murders, let me say that my granddaughter Lucy has just turned 2. She, along with my 3 other grandchildren, is my second chance, now that I've carved out a spiritual identity as dramatically eclipsing of my former self as if I disappeared into a witness protection program. My 4 grandchildren, Amanda, Benjamin, Lucy, and Jack notwithstanding, I'm still prone to label people and ideas as my mother labeled them. Mom divided everything into very important things, say Jesus, virginity, Japanese flower arrangements, lust, see-through black lingerie to be enjoyed only after marriage, and everything else, say those things that barely registered on my mother's to-do list, like homeschooling me. So I'll be capitalizing some words oddly in this book, such as sin, God, love, and girls, and also words like him when referring to God. I'm not doing this as a theological statement, but as a nervous tic, left over from my Edith Shaeffer-shaped childhood, and also to signal what loomed large to my mother and what still looms large to me. Blessedly, Lucy and Jack live only a few hundred feet up the street. I walk to their house every day and collect them for playtime. When it's Lucy's turn, she perches in my arms and talks to me. Jack is 6 months old and pulls my nose and laughs a lot, but isn't saying much yet. Lucy likes to be carried when we stroll back to Ba and Nana's house. I'm Ba, and my wife, Jeannie, is Nana. Lucy's big brown eyes scan the 18th century clapboard houses of our New England neighborhood to see which of the ubiquitous American flags are wrapped around their above the front door flagpoles by the wind, Ba, and which are waving free in the ocean breeze. When we get to my house, Lucy commands me to read The Tale of Two Bad Mice by Beatrix Potter. It's a story about 2 deluded mice, Hunca Munca and Tom Thun, who mistake a dollhouse dinner laid out in the dollhouse's miniature dining room for real food. When they discover that the lovely-looking ham, fish, and pudding can't be eaten, they smash up the plaster food in revenge and then spitefully ransack the dollhouse. When she wrote the book in 1904, Potter couldn't have known that her classic story would someday be an allegory aptly illustrating the delusions suffered by members of the American religious right. Some people who helped lead that movement, including me, were very much like Hunca Munca and Tom Thumb. We lived lives informed by beliefs that were not based on fact, and that led to deep-seated resentments that couldn't be cured because what we resented never actually happened. We took it as a personal insult that the real world didn't conform to the imagined religious facts that we'd been indoctrinated to believe, and so we did our share of smashing. My late father, Francis Shaeffer, was a key founder and leader of the religious right. My mother, Edith, was herself a spiritual leader, not the mere power behind her man, which she also was. Mom was a formidable and adored religious figure whose books and public speaking, not to mention biblical conditioning of me, directly and indirectly shapes millions of lives. For a time, I joined my dad in pioneering the evangelical anti-abortion religious right movement. In the 1970s and early 1980s, when I was in my 20s, I evolved into an ambitious, successful religious leader instigator in my own right. And I wasn't just Dad's sidekick. I was also Mom's collaborator in her mission to reach the world for Jesus. I changed my mind. I no longer ride around saving America for God, nor am I a regular on religious TV and radio these days. Nevertheless, like those two bad mice who later felt remorse and so put a crooked sixpence in the doll's Christmas stocking to pay for the damage they'd caused, I'm determined to acknowledge the destruction I contributed to before Lucy grows old enough to inherit the vandalized dollhouse that shall soon discover lurking beyond her childhood horizon. So that's the beginning of that book. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, why I wrote it, and then I will be glad to take your questions. The trilogy here, which my publisher calls the God Trilogy, comes out of personal experience, lived on two levels. One is as the child of a preacher who then became a religious right figure and a political figure in America. And the world seen through a child's eyes sometimes brings a reality to a subject that is missed by adults who don't hear the arguments at night once the light's out in their parents' room, who don't see the inside story of the hero that sometimes other people put on a pedestal. But then there's a second thread that runs through these three books, and that is my own life journey, which began with me as the sidekick of my father, Francis Shaeffer, in my late teens and early 20s, when I helped him make a film series called How Should We Then Live, with a book companion, and another film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with a book companion, that one with C. Everett Koop, who became Surgeon General of the United States under Ronald Reagan. And those two series together did two things. First of all, they made my father very famous in the evangelical ghetto, and I say evangelical ghetto not in a sense of disparagement. We all live in ghettos, whatever club we're part of. We are in an Orthodox church today, so we know about Orthodox things, and people who know about NASCAR like cars turning left. And those of us who live in the States don't know that any other countries exist most of the time. We just live here. So what I mean by evangelical ghetto is simply that you can be very famous in one little sliver of our culture, but have never been heard of by most other people, and that would have been Dad's case. But within the evangelical community, if you had asked somebody in 1979 or 1983 who the leaders were, and certainly the intellectual leaders of evangelicalism, my dad's name would have been at the top of many lists, if not most lists, and certainly on the top of all lists. And evangelicalism shares something with North Korea, as a matter of fact, and that is a nepotistic system of succession. So if I had been in North Korea, I would have been Kim Il-jung the 17th or whatever. But being the son of an evangelist, it seemed very natural for me to become his sidekick. And I was not alone. Franklin Graham now runs the Billy Graham organization. Oral Roberts' son, Richard, who I knew quite well in the past, in fact, I knew all these people well, inherited that and then finally had a divide with the college and separated from them. All kinds of other people. Pat Robertson's kid ran the 700 Club for a while and so forth. It seems normal. And we were kind of bred for these leadership positions, as I say, perhaps not to inherit the call from the Holy Spirit, but certainly to inherit the mailing list, which to most of us seemed a lot more valuable. So that was my world. Son of a preacher who went to Europe as a fundamentalist missionary in the 50s and was very obscure and unknown. And I talk about in the book, Sex, Mom, and God, how one of the great desires of my youth was to have protein, any kind of protein, in the sense that we had a very meatless diet, and it had nothing to do with keeping Eastern Orthodox fasts either. It just had to do with the fact that my parents were trying to stretch macaroni and cheese a long way to feed a lot of students and hitchhikers and backpackers who came through to their ministry called L'Abri Fellowship in those days. One of the great things about having a dad who wrote some bestsellers and then became a speaker on the American evangelical circuit is I got to go along and eat a lot of porterhouse steak. So it was too little and too late, but it was great to finally get the protein that I'd prayed for. So it was also an answer to prayer, which is great. So you have a spiritual element tying into it. So in Sex, Mom, and God, and Crazy for God, and Patience with God, I tell a story that I had euphemistically alluded to in my early novels, my Calvin Becker trilogy, some of you may have read, Portofino, Zermatt, and Saving Grandma, which are the stories of a child of fundamentalist missionaries in Europe in the 1960s in the age of La Dolce Vita when Fellini was doing his stuff. Europe was a lovely place. You could really live there on $5 a day or travel, and Italy was the cheap vacation for us. And so Portofino was where we went in the summers. Took a train for 4.5 hours, and we were down there on the Mediterranean. And that's when turquoise became my favorite color, because in those days the Mediterranean was turquoise and perhaps still is. And we had a wonderful time. But my introduction to vacationing was a little different than the other people in the pensione, other regular guests who came every year, because they did not die of mortification every night and ask the Paragi beach to swallow them, because their mothers did not say long, preachy graces over the meal in order to evangelize and witness to all those lost Roman Catholic Italians or Church of England people. My dad would say that C of E actually represented Christmas and Easter, which he said was the only time they went to church, unlike us that were there often. And so Mom would say her long graces, and I would be watching the olive oil combined with my mortadella and little pieces of olive float away and so forth. But eventually she would end, and even if the pastini and brodo was cold, we would eat. So I began as the son of these obscure evangelicals, but here's a serious point, and I talk about it in Sex, Mom, and God. In those days, their mission in life was to convert people to Jesus Christ. It was a simple mission that my dad pursued, and so did my mother, with a good intent and complete integrity. This was not a scam or a money-making operation. They meant what they said. And their goal for people who came to L'Abri was to get them to believe right as they would define it. If you fast forward to today, right now, in the United States of America, the goal of the evangelical movement, it seems, if you read the media, is to get you to vote right. And we have become politicized to the point where you're not a real Christian in some people's minds if you vote for Democratic candidates. I've been a supporter, for instance, of Barack Obama and written about this, and I've had people write to me on the basis of supporting the wrong candidate and tell me that I therefore must no longer be a Christian. Back when my parents began their evangelical mission, being a Christian had to do with trying to follow the person and teaching of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm speaking in vast generalities, but it would have shocked Dad, say in 1965, sitting in Switzerland, if you had said to him, there will come a day when evangelicalism will no longer be known primarily as something that wishes to convert people to a spirituality that puts Christ at the center of their life rather than material well-being, rather than getting ahead, rather than winning. Instead, what is going to be the actual motivator for most of the fundraising letters, for the big-time activities, is going to be politics. Sometimes the politics will be Christian Zionism and people like John Hagee with the Church of 50,000 in Dallas, who will be more ardent supporters of Israel than even people living on the West Bank, occupying those territories and having a lot of babies. John Hagee will be even more ardent Christian Zionist than the Zionists are Zionists. It'll be a weird thing, but in his book, you can't be a Christian unless you're a right-wing neoconservative who wants to use the American military to hammer our, quote, Arab enemies. So that'll be Christianity for him. And then there'll be other people like James Dobson writing fundraising letters to his followers telling them that if you vote for candidates that, for instance, believe in gay rights, you cannot any longer call yourself a Christian. Whereas back in L'Abri, as I talk about in my book here, my parents, in hindsight, and of course this is very subjective, were much better people than their theology, because they were very strict Calvinist Protestant Christians if you went by the book in terms of the creeds they would sign on to and what they believed. But how they treated individuals was entirely different. We had gay people in our home, even helpers and workers in L'Abri who were openly gay. And my father was not running around saying, I'll try to pray the gay out of you or heal you, and if you're gay, you're lost and somehow dirty and filthy, or the sort of things that candidates like Michelle Bachmann have gone around the country saying, that gays scare her, or it's demonic, or whatever. There was no talk like that. And so the official belief did not then kick out into another way of treating people that was inhumane, because there was an underlying message to the gospel, my father believed, that kind of trumped all other moral categories, and that was to do unto others as you would be done by, or to do what Christ said, and that is, even in the case of the enemy, turn the other cheek. And so huge shifts took place. So what Sex, Mom, and God, Crazy for God, and Patience with God chronicle are three stories. First of all is my story, because millions of people were raised like me on the same Bible stories, on the same Bronze Age mythology, taken absolutely literally by people who believe Scripture is inerrant, etc., and speaks as accurately to biology and anthropology as it does to the person of Christ. So there was that literalism. It tells the story of how a child changed his mind about that child being me, but also talks about the Bible stories that formed him and the culture. The second story is the rise of the religious right. People who want to understand the religious right, people who want to understand why the Republican Party is now a religious organization and no longer politics as usual, actually have to read Sex, Mom, and God and my memoir, Crazy for God, if they want to get an inside picture. Otherwise, it's just headlines written by people raised mostly in secular environments often, who don't understand what really happened, nor the passions that drive them. And I'll give you one example out of Sex, Mom, and God. I have several chapters on the development of politics after Roe v. Wade that legalized abortion in '73, and then Doe v. Bolton, which clarified Roe v. Wade for the public in terms of the limits on abortion. And I compare it to the way, for instance, France and Sweden legalized abortion. And I talk about the fact that if you had tried for 10 years with a well-funded think tank to come up with a root of a culture war that would never die, or to put it succinctly, how to piss off the most people most instantly and most permanently forever, what you would do is you wouldn't do what France did, which was gradually change the laws on abortion, much has been happening in America state by state. You would have a piece of judicial fiat that would write a ruling so sweeping that from then on, anti-abortion forces could march around with posters of late-term aborted babies and wave them in people's faces and say, this is what Roe v. Wade is. It allows abortion right up to the last month, and so forth and so on. So there was extremism that I chart in Sex, Mom, and God coming from both sides of the early culture war. And since my father and I were the beginnings of the Protestant pro-life movement, literally, to the point we had Roman Catholic bishops and the Knights of Columbus and other people funding our film series, because they were so glad to see Protestants arriving over the horizon like the cavalry on an issue that they had thought they were the only people who represented back in the early 70s. I saw the growth of this movement. And so in Sex, Mom, and God, I chart that, and I'm not going to go through everything that's in the book now because I hope you will buy the book and read it. But believe me, by the end of it, you will have a personalized view, but I think you'll also have a piece of American history told in a way that is personal and at the same time gives you insight into what really happened here and why, for instance, today's headlines about politics are all about these litmus tests of moral issues. And I'll just give you one conclusion I drew in Sex, Mom, and God, and then move on to the third thread, which is seeing the world through my mother's life in this book, because she's an interesting case that proves a point. And if I forget what that is, just say, you were going to say she proved a point, and then I'll remember. Well, one of the things I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God is that the result of all our work, if you want to do a big, wide, broad, generalized sketch looking back over 35 years now, was to deliver into the hands of corporate America a group of steady voters who would vote against their own interests, because corporate America really had a different agenda, which was to deregulate the economy, pay no taxes, do whatever they wanted on Wall Street, and go laughing all the way to the bank. But you can't do that if the middle class and the lower middle class, especially the white middle and lower middle class, are consistently voting for people who want to raise billionaires' taxes, regulate Wall Street, try to get ExxonMobil to pay something for the damage to the environment, or maybe even stop destroying the ability of other companies to build electric cars and to do something about global warming, et cetera, et cetera. If those people vote on the basis of both rational thought and their pocketbooks. And so the only way to get this group of people, a huge voting block of people, to consistently vote for you when you're going to do bad things to your country that aren't going to help them, because they're not the kind of people who are paying no taxes, is to get them to vote for your candidate on the basis of other issues they do care about, then once in office do nothing about those issues and just business as usual. And that is really the sum total, the result. One of the things I talk about in Sex, Mom, and God is I talk about the fact that what happened was from the pro-life movement and the anti-abortion movement came something that really we couldn't have visualized at the time, but I'm going to put it very strongly, and I hope you don't object to this, but it was a genuine sense that the Christian